The moment Prince William opened the sealed file, he expected to find another piece of history. Instead, he found a message that felt as though his mother had written it for him yesterday. For years, William believed he understood what Diana wanted for the future of the monarchy. But inside this old archive was something he had never seen, a private message warning him about the very pressure now surrounding his own children. And then he noticed something even more disturbing. The record showed that the message had not been alone. A second document had once been sealed with it. That document was missing. William's first question was simple. Did my father know? That question turned an old family memory into a very present crisis. During a private review of Diana's archived papers, William had been handed a handwritten memorandum that had remained outside his personal files for years. The message was clear. One day, when he was close enough to the throne to shape the monarchy himself, Diana wanted him to protect his family from becoming victims of royal duty. She was not telling him to reject the crown. She was warning him not to let the crown take everything from the people underneath it. William reached the final part of the message and stopped. Diana was talking about his future children. That changed everything. Because William was no longer the young boy she had been trying to protect. He was now raising George, Charlotte, and Louis inside the same institution she had once feared could place duty above family. For William, the words suddenly felt less like a message from the past and more like a question directed at him. What kind of father would he become? And eventually, what kind of king? When King Charles learned about the discovery, he reportedly reacted with silence. The document had reopened an argument that had never completely disappeared. Diana had always feared that royal duty could become so demanding that emotional sacrifice would be treated as normal. Charles, meanwhile, had believed preparation and discipline were necessary for a future monarch. Both had believed they were protecting William. They simply disagreed about what he needed protection from. Then William noticed a detail in the archive record that made the situation much more serious. A senior royal office had reviewed the memorandum years earlier before it was sealed again. William did not ask for a long explanation. He asked one question. Did my father know? Suddenly, this was no longer only about Diana. It was about William and Charles. And Catherine understood that before anyone else. When William showed her the memorandum, she could see something had changed in him. He barely needed to explain. The way he held the document said enough. Catherine read the section about children and immediately understood why it mattered. Diana's warning was not really about William anymore. It was about George, Charlotte, and Louis. Their lives were already being shaped by the future crown. George, especially, stood directly in the line of succession. Catherine knew that preparing a future king was necessary, but she also understood the danger of starting too early. A child could slowly become a role before he had enough time to become himself. William admitted that Diana's words no longer felt like advice. They felt like a mother reaching across decades to protect grandchildren she would never meet. Catherine refused to let him drown in guilt. She reminded him of something important. He could not obey a message he had never been allowed to read. What mattered was what he chose to do now. Then Catherine noticed something on the archive cover. 2 items were listed. Only one had been delivered. The second item was described as a separate enclosure, a sealed document attached to the main memorandum. William stared at the empty reference. Someone had preserved Diana's first message, but the second one had gone somewhere else. The transfer date made the discovery even more unsettling. The missing document had disappeared from the main file after a royal gathering years earlier. It was the same period when Diana had openly challenged decisions being made about William's future. And suddenly, the family was forced to look backward. Back to a conversation Diana had never forgotten. William had been young when the pressure around his future began increasing. Discussions about education, royal training, public responsibility, and succession were already shaping the life of a boy who barely understood what those words meant. Diana saw something dangerous happening. Her son was slowly being treated less like a child and more like a future monarch. She feared he would learn that loneliness was simply part of royal life. That vulnerability had to be hidden. That sacrifice was proof of loyalty. And that duty mattered more than emotion. The breaking point came after a formal gathering at Windsor. Behind closed doors, Diana challenged the plans being made for William. She believed his childhood was being turned into training for the throne. Charles disagreed. He believed preparation was protection. William could not be shielded forever, he argued. One day the responsibilities would come, and his son needed to be ready. But Diana saw the issue differently. She was not against teaching William how to serve. She was against teaching him that service required him to surrender his emotional life. That argument became a turning point. And that same night, Diana began writing. Her memorandum was her attempt to leave William something he could understand later, when he was old enough to see the pressure she had been trying to explain. But she did something else. She prepared a second sealed note. This one was meant for William only, and she intended him to receive it after he became a father himself. That detail explained why the missing document mattered so much. Diana believed there were things William could never understand as a child. Only parenthood could make the meaning clear. Now he was a father. Now he was close to the throne. And now the missing message was somewhere inside the royal archives. William had spent years keeping distance from the most painful parts of his parents' history. That distance was gone. He now had to confront the past directly. And eventually, he walked into his father's private room carrying Diana's memorandum. There were no advisors between them. No prepared statement. No official language. William wanted his father, not the king. Charles immediately recognized Diana's handwriting. That recognition changed the atmosphere. William asked the question he had been carrying since the moment he found the file. Had Charles ever seen this? Charles paused. He explained that he knew Diana had written something after their confrontation, but he had never read the final sealed version. For William, that distinction was difficult to accept. Knowing something existed but never asking what became of it could feel dangerously close to knowing enough to act. Then William mentioned the second enclosure. Charles's reaction changed. He remembered Diana referring to another message intended for their son when he eventually understood what it meant to fear for his own child. But Charles had never known whether she had actually completed it. William now knew that she had. And the search changed direction. The question was no longer whether the message existed. It was where it had gone. That led William into a part of the royal system he could not simply bypass. The archive contained rules about ownership, custody, transfers, and restricted material. Being heir to the throne did not mean every locked record automatically belonged to him. Officials began tracing the document's history. They followed transfers between private representatives, household offices, and family custodians. Each record narrowed the time when the second enclosure had disappeared from the main file. Then another barrier appeared. Additional permission was required before certain records could be opened. William was frustrated. To the officials, this was an archival problem. To him, it was his mother's final message. Charles faced his own decision. Senior officials warned that reopening old custody records could expose uncomfortable disagreements inside the royal household. It could revive questions about how Diana's private papers had been handled. But Charles authorized the deeper search. And that decision finally produced the breakthrough. An archivist found an old transfer receipt. The wording was simple. Personal enclosure retained separately at donor instruction. William read it twice. The note had not been destroyed. It had not been lost. Someone had deliberately kept it separate. And then they discovered why. The document had been placed in a restricted family collection with instructions delaying its release until William had become both a father and direct heir to the throne. Those conditions had now been met. The message had been waiting for him. Charles authorized the final step. A sealed archival box was located. William was told it could be opened the following morning. For the first time, he knew exactly where Diana's missing words were. But nothing could prepare him for what was inside. The second note was short. That made it harder to read. William had expected another argument about the monarchy. Another warning. Another explanation of Diana's pain. Instead, he found something much simpler. A mother asking her son to remember what it felt like to be a frightened child while adults discussed his future as though he were not even in the room. And then she asked him not to let his own children experience that same loneliness. William stood quietly as the box was opened. The note was exactly where the record said it would be. He took it in his hands and immediately understood why Diana had kept it separate. This was not really a political document. It was not a plan for changing the monarchy. It was a mother speaking to the son she believed would one day become a father. Diana wanted William to remember that a future heir was still a child. That love should never depend on performance. That public approval should never become the measure of a child's worth. And that royal duty should never erase private needs. As William read, he was taken back to his own childhood. Adults had spoken about succession, responsibility, and his future with certainty. But he had been too young to understand what any of it meant. Now he understood why his mother had been so afraid. She had seen the pressure coming long before he could name it. William lowered his head. The emotion he had controlled for years finally broke through. This was different from remembering Diana through photographs or public stories. For the first time, he felt as if she was speaking directly to him. Not Prince William. Not the future king. Her son. And then came the hardest realization. Diana had not written this message simply to protect William. She had written it to protect the children he might one day have. And now he had them.
George.
Charlotte. Louis. Catherine saw the change in him immediately. William told her that something about their approach to the children's future had to be reconsidered. Not because royal preparation was wrong, but because preparation could never become the measure of a child's value. George would still have responsibilities. His position in the succession could not simply disappear. But William no longer wanted that position to consume his childhood. So he made a decision. His household would review the balance between George's future training, public appearances, private education, and family life. But there was something more important than any official review. William needed to speak to George himself. Not as the Prince of Wales. Not as an heir speaking to a future king. As a father. He chose privacy. There would be no staff surrounding the conversation. No formal briefing. No carefully written speech. For once, the crown would not speak first. William told George about his own childhood. He explained that when he was young, adults sometimes spoke about his future as if everything had already been decided. The expectations frightened him, not because he rejected duty, but because so much of his life seemed planned before he was old enough to understand it. George listened. William then told him about Diana. He explained that his grandmother had left a message asking him to protect his children from believing that royal duty was more important than being loved. George asked one question. Had his grandmother written those words because she was worried about William? William answered yes. And that single answer changed the conversation. He no longer needed to explain every detail. George understood enough. William promised that becoming king one day would never mean losing the right to grow slowly. George would be allowed to make mistakes, to discover his interests, to have ordinary moments, to understand responsibility at his own pace. His position would shape his future, but it would not be allowed to consume his childhood. Then George asked something William did not expect. Was his father frightened when he was young? William admitted that he was. That simple confession may have mattered more than any royal lesson. For one moment, the future king was not teaching his son about duty. He was telling him the truth about fear. And William finally understood what Diana had been trying to say all those years ago. She had never asked him to reject the monarchy. She had asked him to reject the idea that suffering was proof of devotion to it. The crown could demand responsibility. It did not have to demand emotional surrender. But the story did not end inside that private room. The change began to become visible. William's approach to his children's upbringing started attracting public attention. The message from Diana had moved from mother to son, then from father to child. And now the public began asking what that meant for the future of the monarchy. Could the institution remain strong without repeating the emotional pressures of earlier generations? William's answer was becoming clear. The royal household moved carefully. Diana's private words were not released. Instead, the focus shifted toward protecting the children's normal development while preparing them gradually for future responsibility. That distinction mattered, because there is a strange danger in trying too hard to protect a future heir. The child can become a symbol of the protection itself. Catherine understood that. She did not want George's childhood turned into a public test of whether William had successfully carried out Diana's wishes. George needed space, not mythology, not constant comparisons with his grandmother, and certainly not the burden of proving that the monarchy had changed. Then a small public moment captured the emotion surrounding the story. Outside Kensington Palace, among flowers and handwritten messages, one tribute appeared to William. It carried a simple idea. Diana wanted you to choose love. The message spread quickly. For William, it must have felt strange seeing his private struggle reflected back at him by strangers. But the public still did not know the full story. They could see the result. They could see a father trying to give his children something different. They could see a future king choosing a different balance between duty and family. And Charles saw the change too. For the king, there was another difficult lesson. William was not using Diana's words to attack him. He was using them to change what came next. That difference mattered, because correcting the past did not have to mean turning the past into revenge. William eventually returned to Diana's original memorandum alone. The document had become a symbol to the public. But for him, it was still his mother's voice. The woman he lost. The mother who had tried to explain something he was too young to understand. Now he finally did. Diana had not asked William to destroy tradition. She had not asked him to abandon duty. She had not asked him to fight the institution that had caused her pain. She had asked him to make the crown worthy of the people who carried it. That meant raising future heirs as human beings before treating them as symbols. Eventually, the original memorandum and the second enclosure were preserved together. The mystery was over. There was no missing page. No hidden final transfer. No unanswered question about whether Diana had completed the second message. She had. And it had reached the person for whom it was intended. William also stopped blaming himself for not finding it sooner. He could not change Diana's life. He could not return to his childhood. He could not erase the moments when responsibility had frightened him. But he could decide which lessons would survive. That was the real inheritance. Not a title. Not a document. A choice. George, Charlotte, and Louis were growing up inside the same institution that had shaped their father. William knew history could repeat itself quietly. Not through one dramatic decision, but through small habits, through silence, through treating duty as more important than emotion, through teaching children to perform before teaching them to understand. He refused to let that happen. Charles, meanwhile, saw his son differently. William told him that he did not blame him for every wound hidden inside Diana's words. The past would never become simple, but perhaps it no longer needed to be. Father and son did not have to agree on everything. They only needed to stop allowing old pain to control the present. And that may have been the deepest change of all. The crown remained. Charles remained king. William remained committed to the monarchy. George remained a future heir. Nothing about the institution disappeared, but one idea changed. Duty could still be passed from one generation to another. Emotional silence did not have to be. Diana's final message had begun as something hidden inside an archive. It became something much larger. A reminder that behind every title is a person. Behind every future monarch is a child. And behind every public role is a family trying to hold together a private life. William could not give his mother back the years she lost. He could not rewrite their history. But he could make one decision she had once hoped he would make. He could protect the people he loved without believing that protection required him to abandon his duty. And perhaps that was Diana's real final wish. Not that her son would change the crown, but that he would change what the crown demanded from the people he loved. The missing message was finally found. The silence around it was finally broken. And William had made his choice. The monarchy would continue. The responsibility would continue. The crown would pass one day to another generation. But this time, something else would be passed down with it. The understanding that a future king must first be allowed to be human. And perhaps, after everything Diana had feared, that was the one part of her legacy William could finally give back. Not a perfect monarchy. Not a perfect family. Just a different beginning.